So in other words, it was recognized this morning, you know, it might be one thing to have equitable access to research data, for example, but if there's a cost barrier to fair implementation, if you have to train people or if you have to build new data resources that are fair enabled, if that costs money, then it raises a barrier to the verification. And so again, you might end up with an admirable goal, but one that results in a very inequitable result. So I think it was very clever to say, okay, we have to look at both sides here, the data creation, but also the data reuse needs to have policy around it, ensuring equitability. This then the roadmap items they had could be broken down into two categories: equity for fair and equity through fair. And I think the idea here is that, yeah, you want to be able to make your data, your fair data equitable access, but you might actually be able to drive in a larger goal, equitability, because you are actually running fair data, right? So I'll come back to the details here. So equity for fair, there can be data ethics. There are frameworks for equity and justice, equity and access, and equity for the assessment of resources. So fair data can empower those things, but you can get equity through fair. So the implementation of ethics and consent can actually happen in a fair way. And I think in a way, we see that with blockchain in the way it, distributed ledgers sort of guarantee honesty, right? It's hard to cheat in blockchain. You sort of take the social component out of the trust factor. So I think the same idea here is that maybe by making let's say your access conditions explicit, it makes it very clear to everyone what your ethics are and what, how equitable your system may actually be. If we're in a world like today where these things can be very vague and, documents are tucked away somewhere that nobody ever reads, then you can claim all kinds of equity without ever having to prove it. So fair may be
Question,
something that reveals it. Yeah. Yeah, George.
one more question.
Yeah.
Does a group, as a group is thinking about equity, are they thinking more about equity within a country or equity between companies or both?
Definitely both. Maybe I can come back at the end here and show you kind of the working definitions we have around the equity. Basically, the idea we were following, the general idea is that there are legal and ethical constraints. There are also conditions set by the data owner. Let's call it the data owner. So, I may license my data in certain ways. I have that right. I can give consent on my data. I have the right to do that. So taking together kind of, the regulatory, legal, ethical frameworks and the wishes of the data owner, taking those into consideration, if a query should come to your data and it meets the requirements of those legal, ethical, and other conditions, then the access to the information should be non-discriminatory. So it should not be because you're from the global south that somehow you have a different kind of restricted access than those from the global north, even if you should meet all these requirements. So that's sort of the working definition of that we have, in that helps us to start operationalizing some of this at the level of, for example, fair metadata. And if there's time, I can come back to it. If I move on to the research performing organizations, like, for example, universities or let's say, companies that do research. Marco Rose reported out here, they were looking for toolkits that would include, among other kind of generic aspects of tooling that you need to do FAIR. It would include agreements among researchers and stakeholders at the onset of a project about their roles and relationships, and that those agreements themselves would be made fair. This would also include the goals of the project. So kind of at the center of open science and the OSF, there's this idea of pre-registration and kind of registering your research projects before you begin to collect data. And I think that was some of the thinking here. There was also a roadmap item on capacity building. So definitely there's a need for more training in fair data stewardship and the skills for that. But this should happen more and more, again, before the projects begin. Now, at the moment, these are sort of add-on features. We have lots to do. And by the way, we have to train people in FAIR. And I think what they're saying here is that, we need people trained. We need trained data stewards to run projects as they come in. And this is going to take time. It's going to take on-the-job training. So not just academic work, but you need to be in the trenches to know how to do this kind of work. And again, Byron was asking about critical mass. And I could just as well put critical mass up here too with the policymakers. So are there, is there a collective of universities, for example, that could develop and run these toolkits or this capacity building? Any questions there, comments? Okay. Category 5 here is the data-intensive industries and service providers, and Jan Lefranc was able to report out on that. What I noticed with this group is that they really stayed close to the academic industry border. So when we think of data-intensive industries, that it could be banks, right? Or it could be organizations that don't necessarily have a lot to do with research. But Jan was really reporting out on kind of at this interface where, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, there is still a tight connection between what goes on in academia and what goes on at those organizations. But they were talking about like a next generation business model that would include reciprocal benefits for academic data that is used. And again, this could be built in a fair way through fair metadata and fair and equitable access to data.
I have sort of a tongue-in-cheek suggestion at this point.
Yes.
I would like to see item 5, data-intensive industry, replace the traditional publishing industry.
Indeed, it is seen that, hey, up here, these publishers are in fact an industry, right? A very lucrative industry. So, but they're a special case. But indeed, what applies here in number 5 could very well apply at number 1. And again,
that would be that might be an excuse to put them right next to each other in this list. I think the order of the list is going to turn out to be important.
Yeah. Note taken. Yeah. I'll explain at the end a little bit too what our plans are for tomorrow and Friday, because we will report out publicly on this Friday, right? Okay, so there was also this like machine actionable access that includes legal aspects. And I think here you would really include even like lawyers in the creation of conceptual models and vocabularies for like legal metadata, right? What you can and can't. So not just licenses, but also contracts and agreements and arrangements. There's a need, it's a perceived need, it was mentioned yesterday as well, for a common vocabulary that can span an industrial world and the academic world. Because I think right now those are two very different lingua franca. It's very difficult to find common ground. There's an interest in developing like mechanisms by which value can be created or co-created between academia and industry. And then again, we jumped in and said, well, what about the critical mass of industry players? And there was a discussion around like industry associations. For example, there is something called the Pistoia Alliance, which is an alliance of pharmaceutical industries. Very interesting, very active industry association. They have very strong, fair development programs running already. GoFair recently became a member of the Pistoia organization just so we could participate in that level. And Becky Upton, who is the president of Pistoia Alliance, will be present Friday. And so we could imagine, for example, that the Pistoia Alliance could help to drive a critical mass on, in this case, fair and equitable information. And then lastly, there was this interest in research infrastructures and data repositories. Rob Hoft reported on this. They saw, I think, what's been felt for a long time, it's kind of a need for API standardization. There's examples of APIs that run more fair like data interactions. So I think there's perceived room for development along those lines.
Research infrastructures and repositories is the thing that we're trying to promote and create and see result in a much greater presence than it's had in the past, I would say. I would almost rather see that listed first on this list, because we're trying to bring research infrastructures into existence.
Very good. I see that. So it could be, for example, we try resorting this list and seeing if we can come up with a rationale for that. I think indeed this was added, that category 6 was added. I think it was Simon Hudson who said, hey, we need a category for this. It's don't call it the publishers. It's not ordinary publishers. And indeed, I think we can reprioritize the listing here. Note taken.
Eric, I got one general comment.
Yes.
These areas and all of these sub areas are an excellent list of important things to do.
Yep.
But it seems to me they're more important than the topic that created them. And by that I mean, let's say that the research enterprise has 2 overriding goals. Equity, yes, but also, and perhaps first, excellence.
Yeah.
And these various points seem to me to promote excellence as well as promoting equity.
Yeah. And you think that's a good thing?
I do.
Yeah.
I think it's fortunate that they are both being promoted by the same list of activities.
The funny thing is, George, especially if we go back to the policy here, this equity for versus equity through, I think that's an emerging theme this week. That, for example, fair approaches can actually drive some of these, excellence in data provision, right? If you just want higher quality data, FAIR gets you there. Even though FAIR explicitly leaves out any mention of quality, the act of just making things explicit and machine actionable, even ordinary researchers will find value in that, because it's they say, even if my data doesn't go on the computer, this was a great exercise because it clarified to myself what I'm actually doing. So there is something to say about the act of FAIRification seems to promote a lot of very positive values. And maybe that's something we can flag as well in the next 10 years. So that was the status for today. Just real